The early morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 304, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Judge William Hawthorne's footsteps echoed through the quiet hallway as he made his way to his chambers. At 62 years old, he had been presiding over this traffic court for the past 15 years, earning a reputation as one of the strictest and most unforgiving judges in Harrison County. Adjusting his black robe in front of the mirror, he smoothed the fabric with hands that had signed countless verdicts over the years. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his stern expression was already firmly set, the same expression he wore every Monday morning when preparing to face a packed courtroom. Another day, another docket full of excuses, he muttered under his breath, picking up his coffee mug. The ceramic cup, a gift from his daughter, read World's Toughest Judge, a title he embraced with pride rather than humor. Outside his chambers, the courthouse buzzed with life. Court clerk Sarah Thompson, a middle-aged woman who had worked alongside Judge Hawthorne for over a decade, was busily organizing the day's cases. She glanced at the growing crowd in the courtroom, her brow creased with concern. Today's docket was particularly full, over 40 cases needed to be processed before lunch. "Good morning, Your Honor," Sarah greeted as the judge emerged from his chambers. She handed him the first stack of files, careful to arrange them in the precise order he preferred. "We have a busy morning ahead, mostly parking violations and speeding tickets." Judge Hawthorne barely nodded, taking the files without a word. He followed his usual route through the side door and climbed the 3 steps to his bench with practiced precision. The bailiff's voice rang out, clear and commanding, "All rise." The Honorable Judge William Hawthorne presiding. The rustle of people standing filled the courtroom. Judge Hawthorne surveyed the crowd, his sharp eyes noting the mix of frustrated faces, nervous first-timers, and resigned regulars. With slight irritation, he observed that the wooden benches were unusually crowded. The sunlight now fully illuminated the room, highlighting floating dust particles and the anxious expressions of the defendants. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority. The room was filled with the sounds of shuffling feet and creaking wood as everyone settled into their seats. Below the judge's bench, Sarah worked steadily, organizing the paperwork with practiced efficiency. Years of experience had taught her to read the judge's moods, and she could tell that today he was particularly rigid. The morning heat was already building, and the courthouse's ancient air conditioning struggled to keep the room cool, adding to the discomfort. "First case," Judge Hawthorne announced, not bothering to glance up from his papers. His system, honed over years, was simple: keep the proceedings moving, avoid personal involvement, and never let emotions cloud judgment. It was a method he believed served justice, though others often found it cold. Officer James Martinez, the bailiff, stood ready by the entrance. Having worked with Judge Hawthorne for years, he knew exactly how the judge liked the courtroom to be run. The morning sunlight reflected off the badge on his uniform as he prepared to call the first case. In the back rows, people shifted nervously in their seats. Some checked their watches, others reviewed paperwork, and a few whispered to companions. The atmosphere was thick with tension and anticipation. Judge Hawthorne took a sip of his coffee, his eyes scanning the first file of the day. He had seen cases like these countless times before, defendants offering excuses, pleading for leniency, or citing extenuating circumstances. In his view, the law was clear, and it applied equally to everyone. Or at least, that's what he told himself. Unbeknownst to him, this seemingly ordinary Monday morning would prove different. Among the faces in the courtroom was someone who would challenge not just his authority but his entire worldview. The proceedings moved efficiently, case after case processed without delay. As the clock neared 10:30 a.m., Senator Regina Matthews sat quietly in the back row. Dressed in a navy blue business suit with her natural hair neatly styled, she maintained a calm and composed demeanor. A leather briefcase rested beside her feet. Unlike the nervous energy emanating from other defendants, Regina appeared poised. Her morning had started early with calls about a new education bill, yet she had made time to appear in court for a personal matter. The parking ticket in her hand cited a $100 fine for parking in what she believed was an incorrectly marked zone outside the Thompson Community Center. Beside her sat her young assistant, Michael Chen, who frequently checked his phone, whispering updates about rescheduled meetings. "Senator, we can push the 11:30 with the Education Board," he murmured. Regina shook her head subtly. She believed in addressing personal matters properly, just as she expected from others. The courtroom grew stuffier as the outdated air conditioning failed to combat the heat of too many bodies in a confined space. A baby's cry broke the monotony, quickly hushed by its mother. Papers shuffled, whispers grew softer, and the tension heightened as people awaited their turn. "Case number 47, Officer Martinez announced. Regina Matthews, parking violation on Cedar Street, Thompson Community Center Zone." The senator rose gracefully, adjusting her jacket. Her movements commanded attention, and several heads turned as she walked down the center aisle. Michael remained seated but sat up straighter, watching closely. Judge Hawthorne, already weary from what he considered a morning of excuses, didn't look up from his papers. His coffee cup was empty, and his patience was running thin. "Miss Matthews," he began flatly, "you are charged with parking in a restricted zone on Tuesday, March 15th, at 2:45 p.m. How do you plead?" Regina's voice was steady and clear. "Your Honor, while I acknowledge parking in that location, I believe there is an important matter regarding the question," Judge Hawthorne interrupted, his tone sharp. "How do you plead?" A slight tension crept into Regina's shoulders, but she remained composed. "Not guilty, Your Honor. The signage at the Thompson Community Center is unclear and potentially—" "Miss Matthews," the judge interjected again, his voice laced with irritation. "I've heard every excuse imaginable about unclear signs. The sign clearly states no parking between two." The early morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 304, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Judge William Hawthorne's footsteps echoed through the quiet hallway as he approached his chambers. At 62 years old, he had presided over this traffic court for 15 years, building a reputation for being strict and unforgiving. His black robe was neatly pressed, his gray hair perfectly combed, and his stern expression already fixed. He adjusted the fabric of his robe in front of a mirror, muttering, "Another day, another docket full of excuses." His ceramic coffee mug, a gift from his daughter, read, "World's Toughest Judge." He took it as a compliment, not a jest. Outside, the courthouse buzzed with life as court clerk Sarah Thompson sorted through the day's cases. Sarah, who had worked with the judge for over a decade, was already organizing files in the exact order she knew he preferred. "Good morning, Your Honor," she greeted, handing over the stack of files. "Busy morning ahead," she added. "Mostly parking violations and speeding tickets." Judge Hawthorne barely acknowledged her, heading through the side door to his bench. The courtroom filled quickly, buzzing with the rustling of papers and whispered conversations. The bailiff's voice rang out, clear and commanding, "All rise." The Honorable Judge William Hawthorne presiding. The judge scanned the room as the crowd rose to their feet, a sea of frustrated faces, nervous first-timers, and resigned regulars. With a curt, "Be seated," he began the proceedings. Case after case was handled with cold efficiency. Defendants shuffled forward, pleaded their cases, and left with fines or warnings. The judge's gavel kept time with the ticking clock, marking each case closed. By 10:30 a.m., the courtroom had grown stuffy. The old air conditioning unit struggled against the heat of too many bodies in too small a space. In the back row, Senator Regina Matthews sat quietly, dressed in a navy blue business suit. Her natural hair was neatly styled, and a leather briefcase rested by her feet. Unlike the anxious energy radiating from other defendants, she was calm and dignified. Regina was here for a $100 parking ticket. She had parked in what she believed was a poorly marked zone outside the Thompson Community Center while meeting with local residents about public housing concerns. Her young assistant, Michael Chen, sat beside her, constantly checking his phone. "Senator, we can reschedule the 11:30 meeting," he whispered. Regina shook her head. "No. I need to see this through." Her patience was about to be tested. Case number 47, the bailiff called. Regina Matthews. Parking violation on Cedar Street near the Thompson Community Center. Heads turned as Regina rose gracefully and walked to the podium. Her presence commanded attention without effort. Michael stayed seated but leaned forward, watching intently. Judge Hawthorne didn't look up from his paperwork. "Miss Matthews," he began, his tone flat, "you are charged with parking in a restricted zone on March 15 at 2:45 p.m. How do you plead?" "Your Honor," Regina replied, her voice steady, "while I acknowledge parking in that location, I believe the signage." "How do you plead?" the judge interrupted impatiently. "Not guilty, Your Honor," she said firmly. "The signage at the community center is unclear and potentially misleading." The judge finally looked up, his expression filled with irritation. "Were you parked there during the restricted hours?" "Yes, Your Honor," Regina admitted. "But as an elected official meeting with constituents, I believe it's important to." "An elected official?" Judge Hawthorne scoffed. His disbelief was palpable. "Miss Matthews, this court doesn't give special treatment to anyone claiming to be important. The law applies equally to everyone." Regina remained composed. She opened her briefcase and pulled out several photographs of the parking area. "Your Honor, I have evidence regarding the unclear signage." "Evidence?" The judge's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "This is a simple parking violation, not a murder trial. The sign says, 'No parking.' You parked there. End of story." In the back row, Michael Chen quietly typed on his phone. A few rows ahead, Tom Wilson, a reporter from the Harrison Daily News, recognized Regina and began recording the proceedings. "Your Honor," Regina tried again, her tone unwavering, "as the representative for this district, I've received numerous complaints about this parking zone. The community center serves elderly and disabled residents." "Representative?" The judge's sarcasm was cutting. "Miss Matthews, I've heard every excuse imaginable in my 15 years on this bench, but claiming to be a politician to avoid a ticket is a new one." Tension rippled through the courtroom. Sarah Thompson shuffled papers nervously at her desk, avoiding eye contact. "For the record," Regina continued calmly, "I'm not trying to avoid a fine. I'm raising a legitimate concern about accessibility for our community's most vulnerable members." Judge Hawthorne slammed his hand on the bench, startling the room. "Enough. Your attempts to manipulate this court are testing my patience. Let me make one thing very clear." "Your Honor," the bailiff, Officer Martinez, interjected, his tone urgent. "Not now," the judge snapped. "But, Your Honor," Sarah Thompson spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension, "she really is Senator Regina Matthews. She chairs the State Judicial Oversight Committee." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Judge Hawthorne froze mid-sentence, his face turning pale. He looked at Sarah, who held up a printed profile with Regina's photo and credentials. The gavel trembled in his hand as he read the document. There it was, Senator Regina Matthews, chair of the Judicial Oversight Committee. The judge's voice faltered. I didn't realize." Regina stood silently, her posture impeccable. She had seen this moment countless times, a clash between prejudice and reality. "Your Honor," she said at last, her tone even, "I'm not here to undermine your authority. I'm here to ensure fairness, not just for myself but for the people who rely on the community center. The signage is unclear, and it's creating unnecessary hardship." The judge's face burned with embarrassment as murmurs spread through the courtroom. He cleared his throat, struggling to regain composure. "Senator Matthews," he began, his tone now softer, I apologize for my earlier remarks. It appears I was mistaken. Regina inclined her head graciously. I appreciate the apology, Your Honor. I trust the court will address the larger issue affecting our community. Judge Hawthorne nodded, his stern demeanor shattered. This court will take the matter under advisement. As Regina returned to her seat, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Tom Wilson continued typing furiously, knowing this story would make headlines. Michael Chin gave Regina a small, knowing smile. The judge, humbled and reflective, called the next case, his voice lacking its usual edge. Today had been a lesson in humility, and a reminder that justice must be tempered with understanding. In the silent tension that followed, Senator Regina Matthews stood tall, her composed demeanor unshaken by the morning's tumultuous proceedings. The courtroom buzzed softly with the murmurs of attendees, each sensing the magnitude of the moment. Judge Hawthorne sat frozen, his earlier arrogance and dismissive attitude visibly deflating under the weight of the revelation. The realization that he had grossly underestimated the woman before him left him pale and visibly rattled. Regina's voice broke the silence, calm yet firm. Your Honor, may I now present the evidence regarding the parking situation at Thompson Community Center? As I was trying to explain, this issue is affecting many elderly and disabled residents in our district. The judge's mouth opened and closed several times, as if struggling to find words. His earlier authority now seemed hollow. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Tom Wilson, the reporter from the Harrison Daily News, was already typing feverishly, no doubt crafting the headline for tomorrow's paper. Yes, of course, Senator Matthews, Judge Hawthorne finally managed, his earlier confidence reduced to ashes. Please proceed with your evidence. Regina opened her briefcase, retrieving a set of photographs and laying them methodically on the evidence table. These pictures show the current signage at the community center, she explained, her voice measured and professional. As you can see, there are 3 different signs giving contradictory information. One says, no parking 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., another states, reserved for community center staff, with no time specifications, and a third, partially obscured by overgrown bushes, suggests parking is allowed for visitors. The judge leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up one of the photographs. For the first time that morning, he examined the evidence with genuine interest. Furthermore, Regina continued, this confusion has led to numerous citations being issued to elderly and disabled residents attending medical checkups and social programs at the community center. Officer Martinez shifted uncomfortably at his post, recalling the number of tickets he had personally issued in that area. Sarah Thompson, the court clerk, began searching through case records, her fingers flying over her keyboard. Your Honor, Sarah said hesitantly, holding up a document, I've found 27 similar citations issued at this location in the past month alone. Of those, 15 were given to senior citizens or disabled visitors. The judge's face turned an uncomfortable shade of pale. He looked down at the stack of photographs again, then at Regina, and finally back at the evidence. The weight of his earlier behavior pressed down on him like a physical force. Senator Matthews, he began, his voice stripped of its earlier condescension. The court apologizes for. Your Honor, Regina interrupted gently, I'm not here for apologies. I'm here to address a system that unfairly impacts our community's most vulnerable members. Let's focus on finding a solution. Judge Hawthorne nodded, visibly relieved at her professionalism. Yes, of course. What would you suggest? I propose suspending all parking citations in that area until proper signage can be installed, Regina said. Additionally, I recommend reviewing and potentially dismissing prior tickets issued under these confusing circumstances. Michael Chen, observing from the gallery, smiled faintly. He had seen his boss turn potentially explosive moments into opportunities for positive change before. Judge Hawthorne, now humbled, reached for his gavel but hesitated. He looked back at Regina with newfound respect. Very well, he said, his voice subdued. All parking citations for the Thompson Community Center zone are hereby suspended pending review. Senator Matthews, would your office be willing to collaborate with the court to establish clear guidelines for this area? Regina nodded, her composure unshaken. Absolutely, Your Honor. Our goal is to create a system that serves the community fairly. The tension in the courtroom began to dissipate, replaced by a hum of conversations. However, the lesson of the morning remained heavy in the air. By lunchtime, news of the proceedings had spread throughout the courthouse. Clerks, security guards, and court staff buzzed with discussions about Judge Hawthorne's confrontation with Senator Matthews. In his chambers, the judge sat alone, his untouched sandwich growing stale on the desk before him. He replayed the morning's events in his mind, the sting of his own prejudices impossible to ignore. Sarah Thompson knocked softly on the door, entering with a stack of files. Your Honor, she began carefully, I've pulled all the parking violation cases from the Thompson Community Center area over the past 6 months. She placed the files on his desk, noticing how much older her usually composed boss looked after the day's ordeal. How many? He asked, his voice subdued, lacking its usual authority. 143 cases total, Sarah replied. She hesitated before adding, and, sir, I noticed something troubling. 87% of the maximum fines were issued to minority defendants. Judge Hawthorne's stomach tightened. He picked up the first file with trembling hands, his signature staring back at him on a $500 fine issued to an elderly black woman attending a diabetes management class at the community center. Meanwhile, across town, Regina held an impromptu press conference in her office. The room was packed with reporters, including Tom Wilson, who had been present that morning. Michael Chen fielded calls from news outlets clamoring for the story. This isn't about one judge or one courtroom, Regina explained. It's about systemic issues affecting our entire community. The parking situation at Thompson Community Center is just one example of how administrative oversights can disproportionately harm our most vulnerable citizens. Back in his chambers, Judge Hawthorne stared at his laptop. He searched news archives, finding numerous articles about Regina's work in the state legislature. She had championed education reform, improved community services, and chaired the Judicial Oversight Committee. Each achievement felt like a rebuke to his earlier dismissal of her. Officer Martinez knocked on the door, entering hesitantly. Your Honor, he began, there's something else you should know about Senator Matthews. He handed the judge a newspaper clipping from 3 years earlier. She led the initiative to prevent older judges from being forced into retirement. That law she helped pass. It's the reason you were able to stay on the bench after turning 60. The irony hit the judge like a punch to the gut. He had treated with contempt someone who had fought to protect his career. The weight of his biases, hidden behind years of maintaining order, felt suffocating. Conversations in the courthouse cafeteria bustled around the morning's events. A young clerk showed others a video on her phone of Regina's speech at a recent civil rights conference. She's been fighting judicial bias for years, the clerk explained. She even founded a program to help minority law students become judges. Later that afternoon, Sarah returned to the judge's chambers with more files. She found him still at his desk, staring at Regina's legislative profile on his computer screen. Did you know, he said quietly, not looking up, she graduated top of her class at Harvard Law. She could have joined any private firm but chose public service instead. Sarah said nothing, leaving the files on his desk. The judge leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The events of the day had unraveled him, but they had also planted the seed of a new perspective, one he would carry into his future rulings. A week had passed since the dramatic events in courtroom 304, and the echoes of that confrontation still lingered in the air. Judge William Hawthorne sat alone in his office, his desk cluttered with files and papers that once seemed so familiar, yet now felt like foreign territory. He gazed absently at the morning newspaper, the headline catching his eye, "State Senator's Parking Ticket Leads to Judicial Reform Conversation." Below it, a smaller article read, "Thompson Community Center to get new parking system." The weight of the past week pressed heavily on his shoulders. As the judge absent-mindedly sipped his coffee, his hand trembled. The words "world's toughest judge" now seemed or like a hollow title than a source of pride. His usual air of unshakable authority had been stripped away, replaced by an uncomfortable vulnerability he had never anticipated. "Your Honor," Sarah Thompson said, entering the room and handing him a letter. "You should see this." The letter was from Dorothy Williams, an elderly woman who had received one of the hefty fines Judge Hawthorne had imposed months ago for parking at the Thompson Community Center. "Dear Judge Hawthorne," the judge read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "I missed 3 of my diabetes management classes because I couldn't pay the fine you gave me and was afraid to park there again. I'm writing because I heard what happened with Senator Matthews, and I hope you now understand what these fines mean to people like me." The judge slowly set the letter down, his hands shaking more than before. He removed his glasses, wiping his eyes. Sarah, noticing his discomfort, continued quietly organizing the files on his desk. Elsewhere, at the state capitol, Senator Regina Matthews was leading a committee meeting on judicial reform. The room was filled with legislators, community leaders, and media representatives, all eager to hear her thoughts on the current state of the judicial system. Michael Chen, her trusted aide, stood by the door, managing the overflow crowd trying to squeeze into the room. "This isn't about pointing fingers," Senator Matthews explained to the assembly. "It's about recognizing that even small biases can have large impacts on people's lives." The Thompson Community Center situation is just one example of how seemingly minor administrative decisions can create major barriers for vulnerable communities. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, Judge Hawthorne was doing something he had never done before. He was walking through the waiting area, talking to people before their cases were called. An elderly Asian man explained how he had struggled to understand the parking signs at the community center because English wasn't his first language. A young black mother described how a single parking ticket had snowballed into financial hardship for her family. Each story hit the judge like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the human cost of his rigid, often detached approach to justice. The morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows, illuminating the faces of people he had once seen only as case numbers. Now, each face had a story, a life, and a struggle that could no longer be ignored. Officer Martinez approached the judge with an update. "The new signs at the Thompson Community Center are being installed today, Your Honor," he said. Senator Matthews's office provided translations in Spanish, Chinese, and Vietnamese. He hesitated for a moment before adding, "And, sir, you should know, the senator has been telling other committees about how cooperatively you've been working on these changes." She never mentioned the incident. The judge nodded silently, a wave of gratitude and shame washing over him. He had expected public humiliation, perhaps even calls for his resignation. But instead, Senator Matthews had chosen to focus on creating positive change, a choice that left him humbled. Later that afternoon, the judge received an unexpected visitor. Tom Wilson, the reporter who had witnessed the original courtroom confrontation, requested an interview. This was highly unusual, as the judge had never agreed to interviews before, but something in Tom's expression made him reconsider. "Your Honor," Tom began, "there's a lot of public interest in the changes happening in your courtroom." Would you like to comment on what inspired these reforms? Judge Hawthorne took a moment, looking at the young reporter. Sometimes, he said slowly, we don't see our own biases until they're reflected back at us. Senator Matthews didn't just show me what I was doing wrong, she showed me how to do better. As the interview continued, the courthouse began to empty for the day. Sarah Thompson watched from her desk as a group of community center visitors easily parked their cars under the newly installed, clearly marked signs. One of them was Dorothy Williams, heading confidently to her diabetes management class. A quiet sense of accomplishment filled Sarah's chest as she saw the direct impact of the changes they had worked so hard to make. Back in his office, Judge Hawthorne sat back in his chair after finishing the interview. He picked up another case file, reading it carefully. For the first time in a long while, he truly saw the person behind the violation. His eyes fell on the nameplate next to his desk, which now displayed a new sign, Justice Requires Understanding. The next morning, Sarah Thompson entered Judge Hawthorne's chambers, holding up a report. Your Honor, she said with a smile, traffic violations are down 60%, and appeals have dropped by 75% since we implemented the new guidelines. The judge nodded thoughtfully, studying the numbers. His reading glasses now sat lower on his nose, and the stern lines around his mouth had been replaced by something gentler, something more approachable. The change was not just in the courtroom but in himself. In the courthouse lobby, a new information desk had been set up, complete with pamphlets in multiple languages that explained common legal procedures. Signs clearly directed people to where they needed to go. Officer Martinez stood nearby, helping an elderly Vietnamese woman understand her parking ticket notice. You see, he explained kindly, using a translation app on his phone, under the new system, you can appeal this if you were attending a medical appointment. Do you have any proof of your doctor's visit? The woman smiled with relief as she pulled out her medical papers. Just a month ago, she would have simply paid the fine, missing her next few appointments due to fear of getting another ticket. Now, thanks to the changes in the system, she felt empowered to stand up for herself. Across town, Senator Regina Matthews was reviewing the latest draft of her judicial reform bill. The Thompson Community Center incident had become a catalyst for broader changes across the state. Michael Chin entered her office with a stack of letters from other districts requesting similar parking regulation reviews. Senator, he said, sorting through the letters, these are from other communities that want to implement similar changes. They've seen what happened in Thompson and want to follow your example. Senator Matthews smiled, grateful for the progress they had made. This is just the beginning, she said, her voice full of determination. It's about creating a system that works for everyone, not just the privileged few. We're changing the system, not just one parking lot. Back at the courthouse, Judge Hawthorne sat at his desk, reviewing more cases. He felt a shift within himself, a sense of clarity that had been missing for so long. He wasn't the same man who had entered that courtroom weeks ago, full of arrogance and bias. He had learned to listen, to understand, and to change. The courthouse was a different place now, lighter, clearer, more welcoming. It wasn't just the changes to the parking system or the new signs at the Thompson Community Center. It was the realization that true justice required empathy and a willingness to see people not just as offenders, but as human beings. And that, Judge Hawthorne realized, was the most profound lesson of all. 6 months after the fateful day that changed everything, Judge William Hawthorne stood at a podium at the National Judicial Conference in Washington, D.C., surrounded by an audience of legal professionals. His heart raced, hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his notes. The ballroom, packed with judges, lawyers, and legal experts, seemed a world away from the courthouse in Harrison County, where his life had been irrevocably altered. His eyes briefly met Senator Regina Matthews, who stood nearby, offering an encouraging smile. "My story," Judge Hawthorne began, his voice steady and clear, "is not about a parking ticket. It's about the moment I was forced to see my own prejudices clearly for the first time." He paused, scanning the faces before him. "I had convinced myself that being tough meant being right. I was wrong." In the front row, Sarah Thompson, the courthouse staffer who had been with him through this transformation, sat proudly next to Officer Martinez, who had been instrumental in implementing the changes. Alongside them were members of the community whose lives had been directly impacted by the reforms. Dorothy Williams, the woman who had once missed vital medical appointments due to parking fines, now sat in the front row, her face filled with pride. Beside her was a Vietnamese grandmother who had been a regular volunteer at the courthouse's new information desk, helping other non-English speakers navigate the system. "The transformation of our courthouse didn't happen overnight," Judge Hawthorne continued, his voice tinged with humility. "It began with one moment of humility followed by countless small changes." He clicked to the next slide on the presentation, showing before and after images of the Thompson Community Center parking area, pictures that symbolized the entire shift in his approach. Senator Matthews stepped up to the podium next, her voice confident as she addressed the room. "What happened in Harrison County is not just a local success story," she said. "It's a model for how we can transform our justice system, one courtroom at a time." She highlighted key statistics: parking violations down 60%, community participation up by 40%, and trust in the legal system significantly improved. But it was the personal stories that had the greatest impact. These were the stories of people who had suffered under a rigid system and who were now finding hope, thanks to a change in the courthouse culture. Back in Harrison County, the courthouse had undergone a visible transformation. The morning sun still poured through the courthouse windows, but it now illuminated a much different scene. Signs in multiple languages greeted visitors, and a newly established help desk staffed by volunteers was ready to assist citizens with questions about the court system. The atmosphere in courtroom 304 was no longer one of fear and intimidation but one of respect and understanding. After the conference, Judge Hawthorne and Senator Matthews sat together in a hotel restaurant, discussing the future of their work. Michael Chen, Matthews' aide, joined them, carrying a stack of letters from other jurisdictions eager to implement similar reforms. "You know," Judge Hawthorne said quietly, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "I almost retired after that day. I thought it was the end of my career." He glanced at Senator Matthews, his voice full of gratitude. "Instead, it became a new beginning." Senator Matthews smiled warmly. "Sometimes our most difficult moments become our greatest opportunities for growth." She passed him a folder containing good news. The state legislature had approved funding to expand their program to 5 additional counties. Later that evening, back in Harrison County, Judge Hawthorne received an update from Sarah. The courthouse was running smoothly under the new system. A young, inspired judge, who had observed the changes and was eager to learn, was shadowing cases. Sarah also had good news about the law student who had written to Judge Hawthorne months earlier. The student had passed the bar exam and was now applying for a position in their district. The next morning, as Judge Hawthorne reviewed his conference speech, he added a personal note at the bottom: "The measure of justice is not in how tough we can be, but in how well we can understand each other." On the flight back to Harrison County, he reflected on how far he had come since that pivotal morning. His phone buzzed with messages from other judges who had heard about the Harrison County reforms and wanted to learn more. The Harrison County model, as it had come to be known, was now being studied at law schools across the country. As his plane landed back in Harrison County, Judge Hawthorne felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He thought about the docket waiting for him the next day: more cases, more stories, more opportunities to continue the work of blending justice with compassion. His transformation had been nothing short of profound. The world's toughest judge was now a figure who had learned to listen before judging. The following morning, Judge Hawthorne entered the courthouse, passing a new plaque on the wall that read, "Justice serves all." Below it was a photo of the dramatic day 6 months ago when a parking ticket had sparked a nationwide conversation about judicial reform. The photo showed Senator Matthews at the podium, with a very different Judge Hawthorne sitting at the bench. The judge paused briefly, touching the plaque before heading to his chambers. The morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows, lighting the way forward, just as it had done every day since that life-changing moment in courtroom 304.